I'd like to say we appreciate your presence here this morning and hope that the things that we have to say will be of importance to us today and will be something that we can use. For a while, I've thought about this topic, about a legacy, a family legacy that I'm sure many of us hope for or yearn for, but I want to talk about this because I think it's very important to you and I to understand that that's one of the things that God very much wants for you and I. Now, as we begin this morning, I'd like to, if I can get this to work right here. Kind of, did I go the wrong way with it or something? I don't know. I guess we're going to have it in bits and pieces here. But anyway, I'd like to begin by reading from the book of Acts, the 10th chapter and the 24th verse to introduce the topic of the morning. Get myself organized here. I've got papers that don't want to participate this morning. In Acts, the 10th chapter and the 24th verse is written there, "And the morrow after they entered into Caesarea, and Cornelius waited for them, and had called together his kinsmen and his near friends." You know, here's a story or a verse about a man named Cornelius who lived in the area of Caesarea, and he has called for Peter to come and to talk to him. But before he does that, before Peter arrives, the scripture said here that this man called together his kinsmen, as many as he could possibly round up. He called together his near friends because he wanted them to hear as well as he what the Apostle Peter was about to say to them. He must have felt that they needed to be influenced by God and that God had something very important for him on that day because God had sent him a vision and said to him, "You call for Peter, and so he can talk to you about some things that are very important to you." And so that's where this narrative begins with this man here who prayed to God and did a lot of things in the name of God in the correct way and prayed daily. And his prayers came up to God and God answered him in a vision. You know, this morning as we go through this lesson, if I can get this thing to work right, I want to talk about a couple of areas. First of all, I want to talk about family influence, what that has to do about a godly legacy. And secondly, I want to talk about families that are influenced by God. So those are two areas that I want to cover this morning. And so as we begin this morning, let's go talk about family influence. You know, there was a family by the name of, his man's name was Max Juke, and they lived in New York. And this has been several years ago that this was done, by the way, as you'll see by some of the numbers that come up. But when you think about this family, Max Juke did not believe in religion. Was an interesting thing that you need to know. Another thing is that he married a woman who was also of the same opinion. She didn't think too much about religion either, just, by the way. So the next thing that they had 1,026 descendants. Okay? It doesn't take very long for numbers to multiply, does it? I mean, we try to use that to make money when we think about how compound interest works and all this thing. But, when you think about a family, it doesn't take very long before, and I ought to know because I'm like running around with rabbits here. But anyway, it doesn't take very long before those numbers begin to get really big and almost, out of control almost, and you know how that feels. But he had 1,026 descendants. They had 300 of them that died prematurely. I don't know what was going on there, but just the facts, folks. 100 of them had an occasion to be housed in the penitentiary of those descendants. 190 of them were involved with various vices. Kind of a neat family, isn't it? All the things that they got involved with. 100 of them were drunkards. The cost to the state, and remember, this is where it begins to tell, this is many years ago, the cost to the state of New York for these things that we've listed here that they tabulated about this family was that the cost to deal with these people for their vices and the penitentiaries and all this other stuff that they got involved with was $1,100,000. That's a long time ago. That's several decades ago. And so the cost to take care of those kind of problems to society is a very expensive one. And yet, a lot of this goes on. Now, in contrast to this, there was another family, same state, picking on New York today. I think New York's a good place to pick on. New York. Jonathan Edwards was the name of the fellow. That was another gentleman, another family that we would like to talk about. Jonathan Edwards, however, believed in God. And when he decided to get married, he found a woman who was of the same opinion. They had 729 descendants. 300 of them were preachers. It's kind of interesting how this story goes. This was written in a New York magazine. They did the research on this many years ago. 65 of them were college professors. 13 were university presidents. 3 of them were U.S. congressmen. 1 of them was even a U.S. vice president. Kind of an interesting contrast between families, isn't it? Makes you wonder, why the difference? And we often ponder that. Now, I'd like to go to something else. All of us live in Texas, so we're all familiar with the bushes, not the kind that in the yard, but the kind that we, held offices in a lot of places. But George Herbert Walker Bush, as you well are aware, was the father or, the patriarch of this family, so to speak. He was Ronald Reagan's vice president. He was the 41st president of the United States. 41st. I had that right there. He had a son by the name of George Walker Bush, as you know him, W. He was the governor of Texas. He was the first governor to be elected to 2 consecutive terms. Now, the operative word here is elected. So he was elected to 2 consecutive terms. First governor to ever do that. He was the 43rd president of the United States. Herbert Walker had another son named Jeb Bush. He was the governor of Florida for 8 years. He was a presidential candidate. Jeb Bush had a son by the name of George P. Bush, who's still floating around in Texas. As a matter of fact, he is the commissioner of the Texas General Land Office for 8 years. And you ask yourself, if I were to ask you, what was the influence on this family? What do you think the main drive or the main thought or the main thing that they concentrated on was? Politics, right? Becomes obvious when you look at the statistics. Now, let's do this again. This time, let's go to another family, this time in Massachusetts. We're going to move around the United States today. We're going to give everybody credit here for either bad or good, but here we go. You're all familiar with the Kennedys. The fellow started this family was a fellow by the name of Joseph P. Kennedy, big operative in Massachusetts. He had a son by the name of John F. Kennedy, whom you know, and sadly enough, this state very well remembers how John F. met his death here in the state of Texas in Dallas, so you're familiar with that. JFK was the 35th president of the United States. He was a Massachusetts congressman. He was a Massachusetts U.S. senator. Robert F. Kennedy, who was another son of Joseph P. Kennedy. 64th Attorney General of the U.S., a Massachusetts U.S. Senator, Edward Ted Kennedy, who has some good and some bad running all through his life, right? Which you all probably know some of the stories about him. He was a U.S. Massachusetts Senator. He had the 5th longest continuous service as a U.S. Senator. You know, you think about Strom Thurmond and a lot of other people that were there for, seemed like my whole life. But anyway, this guy was there, had the 5th longest term as a U.S. Senator. Again, I ask you, what influenced this family? What do you think their mindset was on? What did they concentrate on most of the days of their lives? Most of their efforts went to the topic of politics, didn't it? Now I'm going to run through some things here. Get you a chance to see if you can guess what this is all about, okay? Family by the name of Griffey. Ken Sr. and Ken Jr. Want to guess what those people did? Give you some more people's names. That's Group A, but let me give it. The Necros. Some of y'all may know these. These people were in the Houston area. Phil and Joe Necro. How about Bonds? Barry Bonds, Bobby Bonds. How about the DiMaggios? Joe, Dominic, and Vince. How about the Alous? Philippe, Matty, Jesus, Moises. Now, some of y'all already know what the answer is. What did they concentrate on? What was the main drive in their lives? Baseball. They're all baseball players, baseball families. Right? Let's go to another topic now. Mannings. Archie Manning, Peyton Manning, Eli Manning, Arch Manning. Some of you already know where I'm headed. Some of y'all go there, right? Matthews, Clay Sr., Clay Jr., Bruce, Keith, Jake, Casey, Clay III. All those people, one family, did one thing. Or involved in one thing. Longs, Howie Long, Chris Long, Kyle Long. The Harbaughs, Jack, Jim, and John. How about Phillips? I'm going to get home now. Bum Phillips, Wade Phillips. Now you probably got the message of what we're going to here. What influenced these families? Where was they at? On Sundays, okay? Football. Now, I have one more. How about the Currys? Dale Curry, Steph Curry, Seth Curry. Get this thing backwards on it. Balls, LaMelo, Lonzo, LeAngelo, Van Gundy's, Jeff and Stan Van Gundy's, Bobby and Pat Knight. What influenced these people? Basketball. That's what they had in common. You know, it's very interesting when you start to consider, when you look at our lives and the things that we're involved in, sometimes those things that we're involved in tell a whole lot about who we are and where we're headed, doesn't it? You don't have to think very long about some of these families, about what they're doing today. They're continuing this legacy that they have started. And they work toward that end, and they spend a lot of dollars, a lot of effort, and a lot of time, with that legacy. I'd like to turn to the book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and the 13th through the 16th verse, as we continue with the lesson this morning. There it says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they be mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better country, that is, and heavenly, where God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He had prepared for them a city." When you think about, when we think about what we just read about how that the list of or the things that God's talking about here, He talks about a family or a group of people whose mindset was focused on God to the extent they said in their minds and in their vision that they sought a better country, whose maker and builder was God, a place that could not be taken away from them. And yet the Scripture records here that they did not live to see their promise fulfilled. They died before that vision became true. Now, make no mistake about it, if you continue to read, you find out that these people, and we'll read a verse here in a minute that makes it plainer, that makes it plain, that these people's hope, the promises that they sought for, they did not and will not lose. But you know, how many of us, as we wake up in the morning, come to the point to where we say, you know, I'm looking for a better place. Maybe what I have is pretty good, but what God promises me is much better. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I have a picture or I have the thought that someday I'm going to reside in a place that God has built, a mansion that He has prepared for me. And I keep that thought in the back of my mind, and it influences me throughout the day. How many have that kind of thing happen? Doesn't happen that often to us, does it? In Hebrews, the 11th through the 4th through the 12th chapter, or verses, of that chapter, we find out that the writer goes on and enumerates the story about Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah, people who had this kind of concept in mind. And you know the families that, as you read through the Bible, you know these families and the legacy that they left. But the thing that interested me was the fact that, you know, the writer of Hebrews makes it very plain that these people had this one common idea in mind. They were focused on the idea that God promised them a better place, and whatever it took to get there, they were willing to do that. They were willing to suffer many of the things that the earth or that this world inflicts upon you and me and them, because they had this vision that God would provide them a much better place in a much better environment someday. You go on in this 11th chapter and you start reading in verses 17 through 38, and you find out that there's a whole list, another list of individuals whom the writer writes about, who were of the same persuasion as Abel and Enoch and Noah and those people. And finally we get to verses 39 and 40, by the way. It says there, and these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promises, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. And what that says is, although they didn't see the promises delivered to them in their lifetime, God's going to deliver the promise that He made to them, or that they look forward to. And so will we see that. God says there's coming a day when that I'm going to deliver on the promises that I made these people. But you know, in the meantime, these people had families and legacies that they left behind, and we read about yet this day. You know, the thing that interested me was that, I'm going to go ahead and turn to the next verse, Ephesians 6 and 4. What my next thought was, you know, a lot I've been through when I was young and dating, and it might not seem like I did that kind of thing, but you know, I did, and I remember some things about that day, you know, and when I think about how helter-skelter my mind was, and trying to find some young girl that I would like, and you know, that I thought I could marry someday, I had a quite different perspective about it then than I do today. But you know, I'm afraid many times in life that's the way it is with us. We don't know that there's a set of rules or descriptions or things that perhaps we ought to be looking at, rather than just wow, you know, the wow factor. And many of us have been victims of the wow factor. Sometimes, you know, we fell into a bed of roses, you know, and yet sometimes it was a horrible thing. But, you know, in Ephesians, the 6th chapter and the 4th verse, God said, and ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You know, God gives to men, the concepts that they need to be very good people. People that can be successful. People who can lead their families and others and make good decisions, good life decisions on like who you marry and, where you going, where you want to go. And it all begins, I'm reminded, with this concept that we find in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, that says you got to have that mindset that says I'm looking for a better place. Not only for myself, but for those that I can influence. And fathers, you have children. You have a wife. You have kinfolks, just like Cornelius did, who you can influence. And God says there's a way to behave. There's a way to do things. Listen to my commandments and do the things that I ask you. Just recently we were talking about a family who has a lot of did a lot of things to do things together, like eat a meal around a table every time, And that's a very important concept. I get it. I'm here. I'm voted for it. But I want us to know that that's not the only thing that establishes a family legacy. But the one thing that I think that if we miss this part, the one thing that if we don't have, it's going to be very difficult and maybe even impossible to develop a godly family legacy without the concept that I'm seeking a better country. I'm seeking to please God. I'm seeking to get to heaven. I'm not just walking out here randomly doing things, but I'm listening to what God says to me, what He wants me to do, because I want to get there. I don't know that I have an attitude a lot of days. And that's not a good thing. Because if you want to develop a legacy, if you want people to follow you, if you want to lead people in the right direction, those are the kind of things you got to do. But most importantly, you better have that mindset. Proverbs 31. I'm not reading all these verses. I just put it up there. You can read them if you want to. But, he talks about how a woman that was, talks about this woman that was industrious. She was honorable. She's wise. She's kind. She's a good wife to her husband. She's a good mother to her children. Bunch of characteristics. I got to tell you, before I met Brenda, I didn't consult the list. Oh, she does a wonderful job at these things. No doubt about it. But I'm here to tell you, I'm lucky. Because I fell into that. But I didn't get there by purposely thinking about those things and saying, man, God wants me to have somebody who's going to help me, Somebody who's industrious, somebody who can be a good wife, somebody who can be a good mother. Hey, that wasn't part of the criteria. And that's a shame. That's not to my credit. It should be something that we think about. You young people, understand that God has given you some criteria to look for. And He doesn't even mention the wow factor. And yet, you and I struggle through life. In Proverbs, the 31st chapter, in the 30th verse, I want to go read that verse. It said, favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. When I think about this, the first two things, favor, beauty, those were the things that were on the top of Ron Benoit's mind on the days when he was young. Man, I want to find somebody that everybody likes, Find somebody who's really good looking. Yeah, that's me, even though I may not deserve that. But I thought, yeah, you know how that goes. You've been there, probably doing that. Some of you are. But how many ever stop to think about what God said? Find you somebody that fears God. Do like Jonathan Edwards. Find a woman that is of the same opinion, or a man that has the same opinion as you do, about serving God and being committed to Him all the days of your life. Because that's where the goal lies. Not in what the earth has to offer, but what God can give you and me someday. Pay attention to the details that God talks about. You know, many today want to turn over to others, especially religious leaders, the development and care of their families, right? You know, I've got kids, they need to be socialized. They need to be social. So I think the church should provide for them that social environment. To some degree, true. But when that becomes a big part of what we do, wrong. Many today are trying to find different ways to get to heaven. And they expect religious leaders to help them believe in those kind of things. You know? And they pick some of the, the most obscure ways to get to heaven that you'll ever see. One that comes to my mind, and I'm not picking on anybody here, but the thief on the cross. People, the first thing they want to draw to is the thief on the cross. I'm like, the Lord's not here today, folks. And you think you want to be saved that way? You better have Jesus in your presence if that's the way you want to go. But so the mindset of people are today. Want to turn it over to somebody else to do that work. And yet God's very plain that that's a father's responsibility. That's a mother's responsibility to take care of their family members and to do things to others that are right and not to do things that are, that hurt that environment. I'd like to turn now to 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, the first 3 verses there to see how well that went or how well that would have worked in days of old. Had someone came on, and said, you know what, let's turn this over to somebody else. And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes and perverted judgment. Now, in the days of Samuel, you read about Samuel, how good he was, and how it pained him when the people said they wanted a king, and he said, he thought that they had turned him down, and God said, they didn't turn you down, they turned me down. But Samuel was a very good man, a man you could trust, a man that you could depend upon. But suppose you'd made the decision, you know what, I really have a lot of confidence in Samuel and his son, so I'm going to turn my kids over to Joel and Abijah. I'm going to let them influence my kids. One generation. And that would have been the very wrong thing to do. You think about David. And you think about, David, he was a fantastic individual. A man after God's own heart. And then you start to think about his sons. One generation. He had a son who even wanted to overthrow him as king. That's the kind of people you want to turn your kids or your family over to? How about Eli, the high priest? Boy, that's getting up in the religious world. Very good man. And yet in 1 Samuel, the 2nd chapter and the 12th verse, he said, now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. In verses 22 and 25, he went on to, let me back up one here, 22 through 25. Now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with women that assembled at the doors of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he said unto them, why do you such things? For I hear of your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people to transgress. If one man sin against another, the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. And so the concept of turning over, the responsibility to other people doesn't work well. But the responsibility or the concept of having people of the same mind and doing the same things. I'm reminded of Jesus when he picked his 12 apostles. I don't know whether you realize this or not, but when he did, he picked Andrew, but then he also picked his brother Peter. When he picked James, he also picked his brother John. You think Jesus knew something about that family? Where their mindset was? And how they conducted their lives? I would think so. Their father didn't turn things over to other people, but brought up his sons in the way that he should. And Jesus recognized it, and he pulled them in as apostles. Interesting concept about, the family dynamics and the things that go on. Now, as I conclude this morning with this lesson, in Joshua, the 24th chapter and the 2nd verse, Joshua said unto all the people, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Your fathers dwelt on the other side of the flood in old times, even Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nachor, and they served other gods. And then you read Genesis, the 12th chapter, the first 4 verses. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of the country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. I can't tell you the number of times I've read these verses. It never dawned on me. And I may be wrong, I don't know, but man, now after I've done this study, I look at this and I go, man, no wonder God wanted Abraham to get away from his kinsmen and out of the country. Because his family was wrapped up with idolatry. They worshiped other gods, the Scripture said. And God said to Abraham, you really need to leave. You need to get yourself out of that country. The influence there is not the kind of influence you need. And I want us to think about, what Abraham did. I want us to think about the fact that the most influential family in the world began when Abraham chose to be faithful to follow God, and to leave his family idolatrous ways behind. Did Abraham think about a country that God promised him, a mansion that God would give to him, an environment that would be much better than the one that he was in? I think so. You look at what Abraham did, he didn't blink an eye. He moved, as we say, lock, stock, and barrel out of the country. Away from his kinsmen, away from the country where he grew up, the friends that he had, because he wanted to be influenced by God and his instructions. And he did. And for that, the most influential family in the world began and lives on today. It's up to each one of us to begin and to continue to develop a godly legacy as far as our families are concerned. But it dawns on me that a lot of times we think that it's just circumstances that dictate, a lot of things that happen to our families. But in reality, there are a lot of things that God says to you and me about the way we ought to conduct our lives and the way we ought to influence the people that are below us and around us that we're not paying attention to. And perhaps if our mindset was like the people in Hebrews, more focused on, reaching the country that God has promised to those that are faithful. Perhaps the influence that we exerted on our family, on people around us, would be such that people will look back in time and say about you and me, that we did the things that started, that continued, that ended up with a godly family legacy. I hope we'll think about these things. They're important to you and I. It's just one point in our lives, but yet a very important point. It all begins with that, and I hope that it influences us in a good way so that we can be just as famous and notorious as the Kennedys and the Bushes, but people, when they look for the influence, say Christianity or God. That would be great, wouldn't it? Somebody would make a list down there several years from now, and our names were on there, and the influence was God. That's what we want to be. We never know the minds of those that are present here this morning. Perhaps you're here and you have a duty to perform. You want to obey God. You want to begin a walk with Him and do the things that are right. He's asked us to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, to confess Him as Lord, to repent of the things that we've done wrong, and to be buried in the water grave of baptism. We stand ready this morning to help you in that occasion. Or if you're here and you need the prayers of the church, why don't you come while we stand and sing the song that's been selected.